The courtroom was packed, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I sat across from the man I once called my husband. Brandon looked confident, almost smug, as he leaned back in his chair like he owned the place. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back just the way he liked it when he wanted to impress people. But I knew better now. I knew what was hiding behind that charming smile. "Your Honor," Brandon's lawyer began, his voice booming across the silent courtroom, "my client has been the supportive husband throughout this marriage. He deserves his fair share of the assets they built together." I almost laughed. Built together? Brandon had never lifted a finger to help with my company. While I was working 18-hour days, coding until my eyes burned, and fighting to get investors to believe in my vision, Brandon was out networking at expensive restaurants and golf courses. At least, that's what he told me he was doing. Brandon stood up then, and I could see that familiar gleam in his eyes. The same look he got when he was about to tell one of his elaborate stories to impress strangers at parties. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat dramatically. "Your Honor, if I may speak," he said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I know this has been difficult for both of us, but I think it's only fair that I get what I'm entitled to. After all, I supported Elena through the tough times when her little app business was struggling." Little app business? My company was worth $12 million, but Brandon always had a way of making my achievements sound small and insignificant. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, nodded for him to continue. I gripped the envelope in my lap tighter, feeling the edges of the papers inside. "Not yet," I told myself. "Let him dig his own grave first." "The truth is," Brandon continued, his voice getting louder and more confident, "I've been patient long enough. I've watched Elena hoard her money while I struggled to make ends meet." "Well, no more." He turned to face the gallery of people watching, spreading his arms wide like he was giving a speech. "After today, I'll finally be able to live off her fortune, just like I deserve." The courtroom erupted. People gasped, whispered, and some even laughed out loud. I heard someone behind me mutter, "What a piece of work." Brandon's own lawyer looked mortified, tugging at his client's sleeve to try to get him to sit down. But Brandon was on a roll now, basking in the attention. "That's right," he shouted over the noise, pointing at me. "She owes me everything. I put up with her workaholic lifestyle, her boring business meetings, her constant stress about money. I deserve to be compensated for my suffering." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine with raised eyebrows. But I stayed calm, my hands steady as I held the envelope that would change everything. Judge Wong banged her gavel hard. "Order! Mr. Cole, please return to your seat immediately." But Brandon wasn't done. He was practically glowing with satisfaction, thinking he'd just delivered the performance of his lifetime. "Your Honor, I'm just being honest about what this marriage really was. A business transaction. And now, it's time for me to collect my payment." The judge's face was stone cold. "Mr. Cole, sit down now, or I'll hold you in contempt." Brandon finally sat, but he couldn't wipe the smirk off his face. He thought he'd won. He thought his little speech had somehow convinced everyone that he deserved half of everything I'd worked for. He had no idea what was coming. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Judge Wong looked surprised but nodded. "You may." I walked across the courtroom, feeling Brandon's eyes burning into my back. I could hear him whispering urgently to his lawyer, probably wondering what I was up to. When I reached the judge's bench, I held out the envelope with both hands. "Your Honor," I said quietly, making sure only she could hear me, "I need you to check the date on his signature, the one on the prenuptial agreement he claims he never signed." Judge Wong took the envelope, her eyebrows furrowing as she opened it. I watched her face carefully as she pulled out the documents inside. Her eyes widened slightly as she read, then she looked up at me with something that might have been admiration. She looked back down at the papers, then at Brandon, then back at the papers again. Suddenly, her shoulders started shaking. A small chuckle escaped her lips, then another, until she was laughing so hard she had to cover her mouth with her hand. Behind me, I heard Brandon's chair scrape against the floor. When I turned around, his face had gone completely white. 3 years earlier, I never imagined I'd end up in a courtroom, fighting for what was rightfully mine. Back then, I was on top of the world. My app development company had just landed its biggest client, and I was finally seeing the fruits of 5 years of non-stop work. The late nights, the rejected pitches, the times I ate ramen noodles for weeks straight because every penny went back into the business. It was all paying off. The charity gala was supposed to be a celebration. My friend Natasha had practically dragged me there, insisting I needed to get out of my office for once and actually talk to people who weren't programmers or investors. I remember standing by the champagne table in my one good dress, feeling completely out of place among all the wealthy donors and socialites. That's when I saw him. Brandon was standing near the auction display, laughing with a group of well-dressed men. He had this magnetic presence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. His suit looked like it cost more than my monthly rent, and his smile was the kind that made you forget whatever you were thinking about. When our eyes met across the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Butterflies. He walked over to me with the confidence of someone who'd never been rejected in his life. "You look like someone who'd rather be anywhere else but here," he said, his voice warm and teasing. I laughed, despite myself. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who feels the same way," he replied, extending his hand. "Brandon Cole, and you're the brilliant woman behind TechFlow Solutions, aren't you? I've been reading about your company in the business journals." I was shocked. Most people at these events had no idea what I did for a living, and the ones who did usually glazed over when I tried to explain app development. But Brandon seemed genuinely interested as I told him about my latest project, nodding and asking smart questions that showed he was actually listening. "You know what's amazing?" he said, as we moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Most people here inherited their money or married into it, but you built something from nothing. That takes real courage." I felt my cheeks flush. I wasn't used to compliments, especially from someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. We talked for hours that night about everything from business to travel to our shared love of old movies. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation. Our first date was perfect. Brandon took me to a rooftop restaurant I'd never heard of, where the city lights sparkled below us like stars. He told me about his real estate business, how he specialized in luxury properties for high-end clients. He seemed successful and driven, just like me. When he talked about his work, his eyes lit up the same way mine did when I discussed coding. "I've been waiting my whole life to meet someone like you," he said as we shared dessert, "someone who understands what it means to chase your dreams." The romance moved fast, maybe too fast, but I was caught up in the whirlwind of it all. Brandon sent flowers to my office every Friday. He surprised me with weekend trips to wine country and beach resorts. He listened when I complained about difficult clients and celebrated with me when we landed new contracts. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had a true partner. 6 months later, he proposed on the same rooftop where we'd had our first date. The ring was stunning, a vintage diamond that he said reminded him of my classic beauty. I said yes without thinking twice. The wedding was everything I dreamed of but never thought I'd have time for. Brandon handled most of the planning, insisting that I focus on my business while he took care of the details. He seemed to know exactly what I wanted before I even knew it myself. The ceremony was elegant but intimate, with just our closest friends and family. During our honeymoon in Italy, Brandon was the perfect husband. He took photos of me in front of every landmark, learned basic Italian phrases to impress the locals, and never once complained when I had to take urgent calls from my office. He seemed proud of my success, always introducing me as my brilliant wife, the tech entrepreneur. But looking back now, I realized there were signs I chose to ignore. The way he always steered conversations toward my business finances, how he'd casually ask about my client contracts and investment accounts, the times I caught him going through my laptop when he thought I was sleeping. I told myself he was just interested in my work because he loved me. I convinced myself that his questions came from a place of caring, not calculation. I was so grateful to have found someone who seemed to accept my ambitious nature that I overlooked the red flags waving right in front of my face. If only I'd known then what I know now. If only I'd realized that Brandon's interest in my success wasn't admiration, it was research. The first crack in our perfect marriage appeared 6 months after our honeymoon. I came home early from a client meeting to find Brandon pacing around our living room, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "I told you, I need more time," he was saying, his voice strained in a way I'd never heard before. "The money will be there, I just need another week." When he saw me standing in the doorway, he quickly ended the call and forced that charming smile I'd fallen in love with. "Hey, beautiful, you're home early." "Who was that?" I asked, setting down my laptop bag. "Just a difficult client," he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "You know how real estate can be. People get impatient when deals take longer than expected." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I pushed down the uneasy feeling in my stomach and kissed him hello like nothing had happened. But the strange phone calls continued. Late at night, I'd wake up to find Brandon's side of the bed empty and hear his muffled voice coming from the kitchen or his office. When I asked about it, he always had an explanation ready. A client in a different time zone, an emergency with a property deal, a difficult seller who only returned calls after midnight. Then the bills started arriving. I found the first one by accident while looking for our insurance papers. A credit card statement with Brandon's name on it, showing a balance of $37,000. My hands shook as I read through the charges. Cash advances from casinos, online gambling sites, sports betting platforms I'd never heard of. When I confronted him that evening, Brandon broke down completely. He sat at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Elena," he sobbed. "I never meant for it to get this bad. It started as just a little fun, a few bets here and there to blow off steam after stressful days." I sat across from him, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. $37,000, Brandon? That's not a little fun. I know, but I can fix this. I have some big deals coming through, and once they close, I'll pay everything off. I just need a little help to get through this rough patch. The way he looked at me then, with those puppy dog eyes that had melted my heart so many times before, I almost gave in. Almost. But something held me back. "How much do you owe in total?" I asked quietly. Brandon's silence told me everything I needed to know. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "About $200,000. I felt sick. $200,000. That was more than most people made in 5 years, and my husband had gambled it away without telling me. "I can't access that kind of money without affecting my business," I said, trying to stay calm. "And even if I could, how do I know you won't just lose it again?" That's when I saw a flash of something ugly cross Brandon's face. Just for a second, his mask slipped, and I saw anger there. Cold, calculating anger. "Your business," he said, his tone suddenly sharp. "It's always about your precious business, isn't it? What about your husband? What about our marriage?" "Our marriage?" I stood up, my own anger rising. "You lied to me for months. You've been gambling away money we don't have while I've been working myself to death to build our future." "Our future?" Brandon laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Elena, let's be honest here. This has always been about your future, your company, your success, your money. I'm just the accessory you parade around at business dinners." His words hit me like a slap. "That's not true, and you know it. Isn't it?" He stood up too, towering over me. "When was the last time you asked about my work? When was the last time you showed any interest in what I do?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he had a point. I had been so focused on growing my company that I'd stopped paying attention to what was happening in my own home. "I'm trying to build something for us," I said weakly. "No, you're building something for you, and now that I need help, you're acting like I'm some kind of stranger asking for a handout." The fight went on for hours. Brandon alternated between tears and anger, between promises to change, and accusations that I didn't really love him. By the time we went to bed, nothing was resolved, and I felt like I was living with someone I didn't recognize. That night, as Brandon slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how everything had gone so wrong so fast. The man I'd married seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone desperate and manipulative. I had no idea that this was just the beginning. The breaking point came 8 months later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports, when I heard Brandon rummaging through the filing cabinet in our bedroom. Nothing unusual about that. We kept all our important documents there. But something about the urgency in his movements made me pause. I crept to the doorway and watched as he pulled out folders, scanning through papers with frantic intensity. When he found what he was looking for, his whole body relaxed. It was our marriage certificate and some business documents I'd filed away months ago. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping into the room. Brandon jumped like he'd been caught stealing. "Oh, just looking for our tax documents. I need them for my accountant." But I could see he was holding more than tax papers. In his hands were copies of my business incorporation documents, partnership agreements, and financial statements. Documents he had no reason to need. "Those aren't tax documents, Brandon." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to get our finances organized." "Is that a crime?" "Our finances? These are my business documents." "We're married, Elena. What's yours is mine, remember?" The way he said it sent chills down my spine. There was something cold and calculating in his voice that I'd never heard before. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Something was wrong, and I needed to understand what Brandon was really up to. What I learned made my blood run cold. He's been making inquiries. My lawyer, Patricia, told me over the phone, asking about community property laws, business asset division, and spousal rights to company ownership. "Elena, I think you need to consider that your husband might be planning something." "Planning what?" "A divorce. One where he gets as much of your assets as possible." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "But he's the one with the gambling debts. He's the one who's been lying. That doesn't matter if he can prove he has legal rights to your business assets. And from what I'm seeing, he's been very careful about establishing those rights." That evening, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed for divorce. When the papers were served to Brandon 3 days later, his reaction was nothing like what I expected. Instead of surprise or sadness, he smiled. Actually smiled. Well, he said, tossing the papers onto our kitchen counter like they were junk mail. "I was wondering when you'd finally grow a backbone." "What's that supposed to mean?" Brandon leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. "It means the game is finally starting, Elena, and you have no idea what you've just walked into." "Game? Our marriage was a game to you?" "Our marriage was a business transaction," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I provided companionship and charm, you provided financial security. Now that the transaction is ending, it's time to settle accounts." I stared at him, trying to find any trace of the man I'd fallen in love with. "I don't even know who you are." "Sure you do. I'm the guy who's about to own half of everything you've worked for." He picked up the divorce papers and waved them at me. "See, while you were busy playing the brilliant entrepreneur, I was busy playing the long game." "What are you talking about?" Brandon walked over to his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Remember when we got married? All those documents you signed without reading because you trusted me so much? Well, let me refresh your memory." He spread papers across the kitchen table. Marriage certificates, property agreements, business partnership documents I didn't remember signing. My signature was on all of them, but something felt wrong. "I never agreed to make you a business partner," I said, picking up one of the documents. "Oh, but you did. Right here, see?" He pointed to a clause buried in the middle of a dense legal paragraph. "You agreed that any business assets acquired during our marriage would be considered joint property." I read the document more carefully, my heart sinking with each word. If this was legitimate, Brandon would be entitled to half of everything I'd built. "I never would have signed this," I whispered. "But you did. Your signature is right there, dated 6 months after our wedding. I have witnesses who saw you sign it." "You're lying." Brandon's smile turned predatory. "Am I? We'll let the court decide that, but I'm pretty confident about how this is going to go. You see, Elena, while you were busy being the trusting wife, I was busy protecting my interests." He gathered up the papers and put them back in his folder. "I suggest you get a good lawyer. You're going to need one." As he walked toward the door, he turned back one more time. "Oh, and Elena, you might want to check your business bank accounts. I've already filed preliminary claims on several of your assets. just to make sure nothing disappears before the divorce is finalized. The front door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with the devastating realization that my marriage had been a lie from the very beginning. The next morning, I sat in Detective Carlos Rivera's office, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I'd discovered. The police station smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and unforgiving. "Mrs. Cole," Detective Rivera said, leaning forward across his metal desk, "what you're describing sounds like fraud, but I need you to walk me through this slowly. When did you first suspect your husband was manipulating documents?" I took a deep breath. "Yesterday, when he showed me papers I supposedly signed. But detective, I'm certain I never signed anything that would give him rights to my business. I'm too careful about legal documents to make that kind of mistake." Rivera was a patient man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples. He'd been recommended by my lawyer as someone who specialized in financial crimes. "Tell me about your business practices. How do you normally handle legal documents?" I read everything twice, sometimes 3 times. I never sign anything without my lawyer reviewing it first. It's been that way since I started my company 5 years ago. "But your husband is claiming you signed these documents 6 months after your wedding?" "That's what he says. But detective, 6 months after our wedding, I was in the middle of my biggest product launch ever. I was working 18-hour days, barely sleeping. There's no way I would have had time to review and sign partnership agreements without remembering it." Rivera made notes on a yellow legal pad. "I'm going to need copies of everything your husband showed you, and I want to bring in someone who might be able to help us figure out if these documents are legitimate." That's how I met Natasha Brooks. Natasha was younger than I expected, maybe 29, with sharp green eyes and an intensity that reminded me of myself when I was building my company. She worked for the state crime lab as a forensic document analyst, and according to Detective Rivera, she was the best at spotting forgeries and document manipulation. "The first thing we need to do," Natasha explained as she examined the papers Brandon had shown me, "is establish a timeline. When were these documents supposedly created, and what evidence do we have of their authenticity?" She spread the papers across a large table in the crime lab, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail. "Mrs. Cole, do you have samples of your genuine signature from around the time these documents were supposedly signed?" I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of contracts I'd signed during that period. I always take pictures of important documents before filing them. It's a habit I developed after a client tried to claim I'd agreed to terms I never approved. Natasha compared the signatures carefully. "Interesting. The basic structure is similar, but there are subtle differences in pressure and pen movement. It's possible these signatures were traced or copied, but I'll need to run more detailed tests to be sure." While Natasha worked, Detective Rivera shared what his preliminary investigation had uncovered. "Your husband has quite a history, Mrs. Cole. This isn't his first marriage." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Brandon Cole was married twice before, both times to successful businesswomen. Both marriages ended in messy divorces where he claimed significant assets. Did he get them? In the first case, yes. The woman was so exhausted by the legal battle that she settled out of court. In the second case, the wife fought back, but by then Brandon had learned to be more careful about covering his tracks. I felt sick, so I'm just the latest victim in a pattern. It looks that way, but here's the thing. You might be the one who finally stops him. The second wife, Jennifer, has been trying to build a case against him for years. She's convinced he forged documents in her divorce too, but she never had enough evidence to prove it." Rivera handed me a business card. "I've already contacted her. She wants to help with your case. She has information about Brandon's methods that could be crucial." That afternoon, I met Jennifer at a coffee shop downtown. She was a successful architect, about my age, with tired eyes that told a story of long legal battles and broken trust. "He's very good at what he does," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "Brandon studies his targets carefully. He learns their habits, their weaknesses, their blind spots. Then he exploits them. How long were you married?" 2 years. But he was planning his exit strategy from the beginning. I found evidence later that he'd been researching my business assets before we even got engaged. Jennifer pulled out a folder thick with documents. I've been collecting information about his pattern for 3 years now. Bank records, witness statements, copies of forged documents. I was waiting for him to make another move so I could finally prove what he's been doing. And now he has. Now he has. But Elena, this time we're ready for him. This time we're going to make sure he pays for what he's done. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Brandon thought he was so clever, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. 2 weeks later, Natasha called with news that changed everything. "Elena, you need to get down to the lab right away," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. I found something that's going to blow this case wide open. I rushed to the crime lab, my heart pounding with anticipation. Natasha was waiting for me with a huge grin on her face and a microscope set up on her desk. "Look at this," she said, pointing to one of the documents Brandon had shown me. "See this signature that's supposedly yours from 18 months ago?" I leaned over the microscope and saw my signature magnified dozens of times. It looked normal to me, but Natasha was practically bouncing with excitement. "Now look at this," she said, switching to a different slide. Under the microscope, I could see tiny particles embedded in the ink. These are microscopic fibers from the pen that was used to sign this document. "Okay," I said slowly, not understanding why this was so important. "Elena, this signature was made with a Pilot G2 gel pen, model number 31256. That specific model wasn't released until 6 months ago. But this document is supposedly from 18 months ago." The implications hit me like a lightning bolt. He backdated the documents. Exactly. Brandon created these papers recently, but he made them look like they were signed over a year ago. He probably thought no one would ever check the ink composition. I stared at the evidence in front of me, feeling a mixture of relief and rage. This proves he forged my signature. It proves more than that. It proves he's been planning this fraud for months, maybe longer. This level of document manipulation takes time and preparation. Detective Rivera arrived just as Natasha was explaining the technical details of her discovery. His face lit up when he heard the news. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "But we need to be smart about how we use this information. If we tip our hand too early, Brandon might destroy other evidence or flee." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, we let him think he's winning. We let him walk into that divorce, hearing confident that his forged documents will hold up in court. Then we spring the trap." The next few days were the hardest of my life. I had to pretend I didn't know about Brandon's deception while he strutted around our house like he'd already won. He'd moved into the guest bedroom, claiming he needed space to prepare for the divorce proceedings, but I could hear him on the phone at all hours, probably coordinating with his lawyer. "You know, Elena," he said one morning over breakfast, "it doesn't have to be ugly between us. If you're reasonable about the asset division, we can make this quick and painless." I forced myself to stay calm. "What do you consider reasonable?" 50-50 split of everything. The house, your business assets, investment accounts. It's only fair, considering I supported you emotionally throughout our marriage. The audacity of it took my breath away. He was sitting there, calmly discussing how he planned to steal half of everything I'd worked for, using documents he'd forged with my signature. "I'll think about it," I managed to say. "Good, because if this goes to trial, things could get messy. Judges don't like it when spouses try to hide assets from each other." That evening, Detective Rivera called with an update. "We've been monitoring Brandon's communications. He's been in contact with someone who specializes in creating false documents. We think he's done this before, possibly with his previous wives. Can you arrest him now?" "Not yet. We need to catch him in the act of presenting the forged documents in court. That way, there's no question about his intent to defraud." Jennifer came over that night to help me prepare for the hearing. She brought more evidence she'd collected about Brandon's pattern of behavior. He always gets overconfident right before the hearing. She warned me. "He'll probably make some kind of dramatic speech about how he deserves your money. That's when his ego takes over and he makes mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "He'll say too much. He'll reveal details about his planning that he should keep quiet. Brandon can't resist showing off how clever he thinks he is. We spent hours going over every detail of the plan. I would let Brandon present his forged documents first, let him make his case to the judge. Then, at the right moment, I would present the evidence that would destroy him. "Are you ready for this?" Jennifer asked as she was leaving. I thought about everything Brandon had put me through. The lies, the manipulation, the months of making me doubt my own memory and judgment. I thought about the other women he'd probably done this to, and the ones he might target in the future if we didn't stop him. "I'm ready," I said. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. In less than 12 hours, Brandon would finally face the consequences of his actions. I barely slept that night, but it wasn't from nervousness. It was from anticipation. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I wore to important business meetings when I needed to project confidence and authority. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I thought about how much had changed since that charity gala 3 years ago. The naive woman who'd fallen for Brandon's charm was gone, replaced by someone stronger and wiser. Brandon was already gone when I came downstairs. He'd probably left early to meet with his lawyer and go over their strategy one final time. I wondered if he was nervous, or if his arrogance made him believe he'd already won. At the courthouse, I met with Detective Rivera and my lawyer one last time. Rivera handed me the envelope containing Natasha's analysis and the proof of Brandon's forgery. "Remember," he said, "let him present his case first. Give him enough rope to hang himself." The courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. Word had somehow gotten out about the case, and several reporters were scattered throughout the gallery. I spotted Jennifer in the third row, giving me an encouraging nod. When Brandon walked in with his lawyer, he looked every inch the successful businessman in his expensive suit and confident stride. He caught my eye and actually winked at me, like this was all some kind of game he was enjoying. Judge Wong called the court to order, and Brandon's lawyer immediately launched into his opening statement about how his client deserved half of the marital assets. I listened with growing disgust as they painted Brandon as a supportive husband who'd sacrificed his own career to help me build my business. Then it was Brandon's turn to speak. "Your Honor," he began, standing up with that familiar theatrical flair, "I want to be completely honest with this court about what our marriage really was." I could see his lawyer trying to signal him to stick to the script, but Brandon was in full performance mode now. "The truth is, I've been patient for 3 years. Patient while my wife built her little empire, patient while she worked 18-hour days and ignored our relationship, patient while she treated me like an employee instead of a partner." The crowd murmured, and I saw several people shaking their heads in disapproval. Brandon was digging his own grave, just like Jennifer had predicted. "But I wasn't just sitting around doing nothing," he continued, his voice getting louder. "I was protecting my interests. I made sure to document my contributions to our partnership. I have signed agreements proving that I'm entitled to half of everything we built together." His lawyer looked mortified as Brandon pulled out the forged documents and waved them in the air. "These papers prove that my wife agreed to share her business assets with me. She signed them willingly, making me a full partner in her company." Judge Wong examined the documents Brandon's lawyer handed her, her expression unreadable. And furthermore, Brandon said, now completely carried away by his own performance, "I think it's time this court knew the truth about what I've had to endure. Living with a workaholic who cared more about money than her own husband? Well, no more!" He turned to face the gallery, spreading his arms wide like he was addressing a crowd of supporters. "After today, I'll finally be able to live off her fortune, just like I deserve. She owes me everything for the years I wasted supporting her selfish ambitions." The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps and nervous laughter. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine in disbelief. Brandon's lawyer was frantically tugging at his sleeve, but Brandon was too caught up in his moment of triumph to notice. "That's right," he shouted over the noise. "I put up with her boring business meetings, her constant stress about money, her complete lack of appreciation for everything I sacrificed. I deserve to be compensated for my suffering." Judge Wong banged her gavel hard. "Mr. Cole, please return to your seat immediately." But Brandon wasn't finished. He was practically glowing with satisfaction, thinking he'd just delivered the performance of his lifetime. "Your Honor, I'm just being honest about what this marriage really was, a business transaction, and now it's time for me to collect my payment." The judge's face was stone cold. "Mr. Cole, sit down now or I'll hold you in contempt." Brandon finally sat, but he couldn't wipe the smirk off his face. He thought he'd won. He thought his dramatic speech had somehow convinced everyone that he deserved half of everything I'd worked for. That's when I stood up. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" Judge Wong looked surprised but nodded. "You may." I walked across the courtroom, feeling Brandon's eyes burning into my back. When I reached the judge's bench, I held out the envelope containing the evidence that would destroy him. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "I need you to check the date on his signature, the one on the prenuptial agreement he claims he never signed. But more importantly," I continued, "I need you to look at the ink analysis of the documents he just presented, the ones he claims I signed 18 months ago." Judge Wong opened the envelope and began reading Natasha's report. Her eyebrows rose higher with each page. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear, "those documents were created with a pen that wasn't manufactured until 6 months ago. Mr. Cole has been planning this fraud for months, forging my signature and backdating legal documents to steal my assets." The judge looked at the evidence, then at Brandon, then back at the evidence. Her shoulders started shaking as she read Natasha's detailed analysis of the ink composition and fiber evidence. A small chuckle escaped her lips, then another, until she was laughing so hard she had to cover her mouth with her hand. Behind me, I heard Brandon's chair scrape against the floor. When I turned around, his face had gone completely white. "Mr. Cole," Judge Wong said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence, "you are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted theft. Bailiff, please take him into custody." As the bailiff approached Brandon with handcuffs, he looked at me with pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you're so smart," he hissed. "No," I replied calmly. "I just learned not to trust people who are too good to be true." The courtroom erupted in applause as Brandon was led away in handcuffs. Detective Rivera was already on his phone, probably coordinating with other jurisdictions to investigate Brandon's previous marriages. Judge Wong dismissed all of Brandon's claims and awarded me full custody of my assets, plus damages for the emotional distress and legal costs his fraud had caused. As I walked out of the courthouse, Jennifer was waiting for me with tears in her eyes. "We did it," she said, hugging me tightly. "We finally stopped him." 6 months later, Brandon was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and forgery. The investigation revealed that he'd targeted at least 4 other women over the past decade, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars through similar schemes. I rebuilt my life slowly, focusing on my business and learning to trust my instincts again. The experience taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem too perfect, too charming, too good to be true. But it also taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, has a way of finding those who think they're too clever to get caught. Brandon thought he could live off my fortune, but in the end, the only thing he earned was a prison cell and the knowledge that his victims were no longer afraid of him. The signature that was supposed to make him rich became the evidence that set us all free.